Have you ever heard a child crying for help in a place where no child could possibly be? Have you ever opened a door that's been sealed for decades and felt the weight of something terrible waiting on the other side? What would you do if you found scratch marks on walls made by someone desperately trying to escape, and then heard that same person calling your name 50 years after they disappeared? And when does academic curiosity become complicity in disturbing something that should have stayed buried? My name is Dr. Sarah Whitmore, and I'm a folklorist specializing in rural American history. For the past 8 years, I've traveled through small towns documenting dying agricultural communities, preserving their stories before they vanish completely. I interview elderly residents, photograph abandoned buildings, record oral histories that would otherwise be lost to time. It's important work, meaningful work, work that connects us to our past. Or at least that's what I told myself before I opened the Hutchins barn outside of Marfa, Texas. Before I heard 7-year-old Timothy Hutchins calling for help from inside a structure that's been sealed since 1968. Before I learned that some stories aren't meant to be preserved, they're meant to be forgotten. Marfa is a strange little town in far west Texas. Population around 2,000, sitting in high desert country, where the landscape stretches empty for miles. It's become somewhat famous for the mysterious lights that appear in the night sky, for the art installations that draw tourists, for being a weird cultural oasis in the middle of nowhere. But beneath that quirky reputation lies the reality of a dying ranching community, of families who've worked this harsh land for generations and watched their way of life slowly disappear. I arrived in Marfa in early October, planning to spend 3 weeks documenting the remaining historic homesteads before winter made the back roads impassable. The local historical society connected me with elderly residents who had stories to share, and that's how I met Martha Gonzalez. She was 83, sharp as a tack, and the unofficial keeper of the town's collective memory. Over coffee in her small house on the edge of town, she told me about families who'd abandoned their ranches, about droughts and economic collapse, about the slow exodus of young people towards cities with actual opportunities. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned the Hutchins place. About 15 miles north of here, Martha said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Been abandoned since the early 70s. Family moved away and never came back. Nobody's touched the property since. Why did they leave? I asked, my recording device sitting between us on the table. Martha's expression shifted, became guarded. Tragedy. Their boy disappeared. 7 years old. They searched for weeks but never found him. Family couldn't bear to stay after that. Moved to El Paso and cut all ties with Marfa. That's terrible. Did they ever figure out what happened? Official story was he wandered off into the desert and died of exposure. But locals know better. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. The boy, Timothy, he was last seen playing near the barn. Big old structure from the 30s, probably the sturdiest building on the property. When they couldn't find him, they searched that barn top to bottom, nothing. But people heard things afterward. What kind of things? Crying. A child crying for help. Coming from inside the barn even though they'd already searched it thoroughly. The father, Robert Hutchins, he became obsessed. Went back to that barn every day for a month, tearing it apart, convinced his son was trapped somewhere inside. Never found anything. Finally, his wife made him seal it up, nailed the doors shut, boarded up the windows, chained it closed. They left Marfa a week later. I leaned forward, intrigued. And people still hear the crying? Sometimes. Locals avoid the property. Say it's cursed. The few who've gone out there over the years report hearing a child's voice calling for help, begging to be let out. But the barn's been sealed for over 50 years. Nothing could be alive in there. Martha's story activated every professional instinct I had. This was exactly the kind of folklore I documented. Tragic events that spawned local legends, the way communities processed trauma through supernatural narratives. I needed to visit that property, photograph the sealed barn, interview other residents about what they'd heard. This could be a significant addition to my research on how rural communities create and maintain ghost stories. "Would you be willing to show me where it is?" I asked. Martha's face darkened. "I can give you directions, but I won't go out there myself. And I'd advise you not to either. Some places should be left alone. I'm just documenting history. I'm not going to disturb anything." That's what Robert Hutchins said too, and we all know how that turned out. She gave me directions anyway, drawing a rough map on the back of an envelope. The property was accessible via county roads, though she warned they were in poor condition. The barn itself was visible from the road. Couldn't miss it, she said. Big red structure with a curved roof, standing alone in a field of dead grass and mesquite. I thanked her for her time, promised to send her copies of my recordings, and left. That night in my motel room, I researched the Hutchins case online, found a few newspaper articles from 1968 about Timothy's disappearance. The local paper had covered the search extensively. The whole community had turned out looking for the boy. Bloodhounds tracked his scent to the barn and then lost it. Search and rescue teams found no trace of him inside or around the structure. The prevailing theory was that he'd wandered into the surrounding desert and died of exposure, and coyotes had scattered his remains. But a letter to the editor, published a month after the search was called off, told a different story. A local rancher claimed to have driven past the Hutchins property at night and heard unmistakable sounds of a child crying coming from the sealed barn. He'd stopped, listened carefully, even approached the building. The crying continued, clear and desperate, definitely coming from inside. But when he tried the doors, they were locked tight, windows boarded from the outside. He called the sheriff, who came out and searched the barn again. Found nothing. The rancher was dismissed as hearing things, maybe feeling guilty about the community's failure to find the boy. I spent the next 2 days interviewing other elderly residents. Most were reluctant to talk about the Hutchins place. Those who did share stories all had variations on the same theme. People heard a child crying in that barn even decades after it was sealed. One woman claimed her husband had gone out there in the 80s on a dare and came back white-faced, refusing to speak about what he'd heard. Another man said his grandfather had helped seal the barn in 1968 and swore he heard scratching sounds coming from inside while he was nailing boards over the windows. The academic in me recognized these as classic elements of local folklore. The mysterious disappearance, the sealed location, the reports of supernatural activity spanning decades. The rational explanation was straightforward. A community traumatized by the loss of a child had collectively created a ghost story, and each subsequent report reinforced the narrative. Wind through gaps in the old structure probably created sounds people interpreted as crying. The power of suggestion did the rest, but something about the consistency of the reports bothered me. Different people, different time periods, all describing the same phenomenon. A child's voice calling for help from inside a sealed barn. That kind of consistency suggested either a shared delusion or something genuinely unexplained. I decided I needed to visit the property myself, document the barn, record ambient sounds, look for structural features that might explain the acoustic phenomenon. If I could find a rational explanation, wind whistling through gaps, animals living in the walls, anything, I could demonstrate how ghost stories emerge from misinterpreted natural phenomena. It would be a perfect case study for my research. I drove out to the Hutchins place on a Tuesday morning, following Martha's hand-drawn map down increasingly deteriorated county roads. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, endless stretches of desert scrubland, distant mountains purple against the horizon, the kind of vast emptiness that makes you feel insignificant. 15 miles from town, I found the turnoff to the property, marked only by a collapsed wooden gate with Hutchins barely visible on weathered wood. The barn stood about a quarter mile from the road, exactly as Martha had described. Red paint faded to rust brown, curved roof partially collapsed on one end, walls still standing solid after decades of abandonment. The farmhouse nearby had fared worse. Roof completely caved in, walls crumbling, clearly beyond salvation. But the barn, despite its age and neglect, remained structurally sound. Whoever built it in the 30s had built it to last. I parked my truck and approached on foot, camera in hand, recording device in my pocket. The October morning was cool, maybe 60 degrees with a steady wind that kicked up dust devils in the dead grass. No sounds except wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. The barn dominated the landscape, imposing despite its decay. The doors were still sealed, thick boards nailed across them, secured with chains that had rusted but held. The windows were similarly boarded, some boards rotted and hanging loose, but most still firmly attached. I walked the perimeter, photographing everything, noting details. The foundation was stone and concrete, solid. The walls showed their age, but no structural damage. This barn could stand for another 50 years if left alone. On the north wall, I found something that made me pause. Deep scratch marks in the wood, clusters of them like someone had clawed at the wall from inside. The marks were low, maybe 4 feet from the ground, child height. They looked old, weathered, but still visible. I photographed them carefully, zoomed in to capture the detail. The scratches went deep, suggesting whoever made them had been desperate, panicked. I pulled out my audio recorder and began documenting observations. Hutchins barn, October 8th, 10:15 a.m. Structure shows evidence of being sealed since approximately 1968. Doors and windows boarded. Notable finding: apparent scratch marks on interior north wall, visible through gaps in the boards. Marks consistent with someone attempting to... I stopped. In the silence after I'd finished speaking, I heard something. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child crying. My skin prickled. I stood perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, muffled, like it was coming from far away or through a barrier. A child's voice, definitely, making the hitching, desperate sounds of someone who'd been crying for a long time. Coming from inside the barn, I approached the door, pressed my ear against the gap between boards. The crying was louder here, clearer. A young boy, from the pitch. He was saying something between sobs, words I couldn't quite make out. I grabbed my phone and started recording video, narrating what I was hearing. 10:17 a.m. Audio phenomena consistent with reports. Sound of a child crying, appearing to originate from inside the sealed structure. No visible entry points. No explanation for, "Help me." The voice came through clearly now, small and terrified. "Please help me. It's so dark, I can't find the door." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was impossible. The barn had been sealed for over 50 years. No child could be inside. But that voice was real, was present, was happening right now. I grabbed the chains on the door and pulled. They held firm, the rust making them inflexible. "Hello?" I called out. "Can you hear me? Where are you?" The crying stopped abruptly. Silence for a long moment, then, "You can hear me? Really hear me?" The voice was filled with desperate hope. I felt tears spring to my eyes even as my rational mind screamed that this couldn't be happening. "Yes, I can hear you. What's your name?" "Timothy. Timothy Hutchins. I got stuck in here and I can't get out. It's been so long. Please help me, please." I stumbled backward from the door, my hands shaking. Timothy Hutchins. The boy who disappeared in 1968, who would be 62 years old if he'd survived. But that voice was a child's voice, young and frightened and lost. This wasn't possible, wasn't real. Had to be some kind of recording, some elaborate prank, something that made sense. But the desperation in that voice felt genuine in a way I couldn't dismiss. "Timothy, I'm going to help you. I'm going to open this door. Just stay calm, okay?" "Okay, please hurry. Please. I'm so scared." I ran back to my truck, grabbed the toolbox I kept for emergencies, returned to the barn with a crowbar and hammer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the tools. The academic part of my brain was screaming that I should stop, should call the sheriff, should get someone else out here to witness whatever was happening. But that child's voice begging for help overrode every rational thought. I wedged the crowbar under the board securing the door and pulled. The old wood resisted, then cracked, then gave way. The nails came loose with screams of protest. I worked methodically, removing board after board, my breath coming in gasps. Behind me, the wind picked up, swirling dust around my legs. "I can hear you working." Timothy's voice came through the door. Thank you so much." Nobody else would help. They all just walked away. "I'm not walking away," I said, pulling another board free. "I'm getting you out of there." 5 boards down, I reached the chains. They were secured with a heavy padlock that had rusted solid. I attacked it with the hammer, smashing at it over and over until finally the mechanism broke and the chains fell away. The door was free. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened with a groan of old hinges. Darkness beyond, the interior lit only by thin shafts of light through gaps in the walls. I stepped inside, pulling out my phone for the flashlight function. The smell hit me immediately. Old hay, dust, the musty scent of decades-long abandonment. My light swept across the interior. The barn was empty, completely empty. No equipment, no hay bales, nothing but bare floor and walls. The space was maybe 40 feet wide by 60 feet long with a loft area along the back wall. My flashlight beam caught the scratch marks I'd seen from outside. Deep gouges in the wood, clusters of them at child height, all over the walls, like someone had tried desperately to find a way out. "Timothy," I called out, "where are you?" "I'm here. Can't you see me?" His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the empty space. "No, I can't see you. Tell me where you are." "I'm right here, right in front of you. Why won't you look at me?" I swept my flashlight across the floor, the walls, up to the loft. Nothing. No one. Just empty space and dust motes floating in the beams of light. But his voice was clear, present, like he was standing right beside me. "Timothy, I want to help you, but I need you to tell me exactly where you are." A long pause. Then, in a smaller voice, "I don't know. It's been dark for so long. I tried to find the door, but I kept getting turned around. The walls kept moving. And then people stopped coming, stopped looking for me. I called and called, but nobody answered. You're the first person who's answered in, I don't know how long. Forever." The temperature in the barn dropped suddenly. My breath misted in front of my face. I felt that primitive animal fear, the instinct that tells you to run, that you're in the presence of something wrong and dangerous. But I forced myself to stay, to keep my voice calm. "Timothy, I need you to think carefully. Do you remember the last thing that happened before you got stuck here?" I was playing hide and seek with my sister. I hid in the loft because I knew she'd never look there. I waited and waited, but she didn't come. Then it got dark. I tried to climb down, but the ladder was gone. I called for help, but nobody came. I tried to find another way down, but everything got confused. The walls weren't where they should be. I kept walking and walking, but I never found the door, and then his voice trailed off. I waited. When he spoke again, he sounded different. Older, more aware. "I'm dead, aren't I? That's why nobody helped. That's why you can hear me but can't see me. I died in here." My throat closed up. "Timothy, I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm going to help you. I'm going to figure this out. I don't want to be here anymore. I've been here so long, please. Please help me leave." I swept my flashlight across the loft area. The ladder was intact, bolted to the wall, but the rungs looked old and unreliable. I approached carefully, testing my weight on the first rung. It held. I climbed slowly, my heart pounding, not sure what I expected to find, but compelled to look. The loft was small, maybe 10 feet deep. More scratch marks on the walls up here, concentrated around the opening where the ladder connected, like someone had tried desperately to reach that ladder. And in the far corner, barely visible in the dust and shadows, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small pile of bones, child-sized, scattered and disarticulated, like they'd been here for decades. A tiny skull, ribs, small arm bones, and next to them, a faded blue shirt, tattered and covered in dust. I climbed down the ladder with shaking legs, my phone camera recording everything even as my mind rebelled against what I was seeing. I'd found Timothy Hutchins. His body had been in the loft this entire time, missed by the searchers in 1968. He'd hidden up there during his game. The ladder had somehow become inaccessible. Maybe it broke and his father had replaced it before the search, and he'd been trapped. Too young to understand, he could have called for help, or maybe he had called and no one heard. He'd died of dehydration or starvation in the place he'd chosen to hide. And his consciousness, his spirit, whatever you want to call it, it had remained, trapped in the barn like his body had been trapped in the loft, calling for help for 56 years while people boarded up the building and walked away. "Timothy," I said quietly, tears streaming down my face. "I found you. I found your body. You're in the loft. You've been there since 1968. Silence. Then, in a very small voice, "That's why nobody could find me. I was too high up. They all looked down here but never thought to check the loft. Your father looked for you, Timothy. Your whole family looked. The entire town searched. They just missed you. It was an accident. Will you tell my mom? I want her to know I didn't run away. I just got stuck and couldn't get out." My heart broke. "Your mother. Timothy, it's been over 50 years. Your mother passed away a long time ago. But I can tell people what happened. I can make sure everyone knows you didn't run away, that you were here the whole time." Another long silence. When his voice came again, it was different. Lighter, somehow. 50 years? I've been here 50 years? Yes, that's a long time. I'm tired, Dr. Whitmore. I'm so tired of being here. Can you help me leave now? The fact that he knew my name when I'd never said it should have terrified me. Instead, it just felt sad. He'd been listening to me, probably heard me talking to Martha, heard all my recordings. He'd been trapped in this barn so long he knew everything about anyone who came near. "I don't know how to help you leave, Timothy. I don't know how this works. You opened the door, that's a start. Maybe if you take me out of here, my bones, maybe that'll help. Maybe I'm stuck to them somehow." It made a kind of dream logic sense. I climbed back up to the loft, gathered the small bones with as much reverence as I could manage, placed them carefully in a plastic container from my truck. The blue shirt went in too, along with a small toy car I found near the bones. His treasures from that last day. As I carried the container out of the barn into the sunlight, I felt something change. The oppressive weight that had filled the structure lifted. The temperature normalized, and Timothy's voice came one more time, faint now, like it was coming from very far away. "Thank you. Thank you for finding me, for not walking away. Tell my dad it wasn't his fault. Tell him I love him." Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Just whined through the abandoned barn and the cry of hawks overhead. I stood there holding Timothy's remains, sobbing like a child myself, while the October sun warmed my face and the horror of what I'd discovered settled into my bones. I called the sheriff from my truck, told him I'd found human remains at the Hutchins property, likely belonging to Timothy Hutchins, who disappeared in 1968. Gave him the location and waited. It took 45 minutes for him to arrive, another hour for the medical examiner to make the drive from Alpine. They photographed everything, documented the scene, collected the remains I'd gathered. The ME confirmed they were consistent with a 7-year-old male, deceased approximately 50 years based on the condition of the bones. The sheriff, a man in his 50s named Garcia, had been born after Timothy disappeared but knew the story. "This is going to reopen a lot of old wounds," he said, standing outside the barn. "But at least the family will finally have closure. Robert Hutchins is still alive in a nursing home in El Paso. He's 93. This might kill him or it might give him peace. Hard to say. I'd like to be there when you tell him," I said. "If that's allowed?" Garcia looked at me carefully. "You a family member?" "No, but I found his son, and Timothy asked me to deliver a message. He didn't ask what I meant by that. Maybe he didn't want to know. He just nodded and said he'd arrange it." 3 days later, I drove to El Paso with Sheriff Garcia. The nursing home was a decent facility, clean and well-staffed. Robert Hutchins was in the memory care unit, his mind mostly gone to Alzheimer's, but he still had moments of clarity. We waited until one of those moments until the nurse said he was lucid before we went in. He was a small man, shrunken by age, sitting in a chair by the window staring out at nothing. When we entered, he turned, and his eyes were sharp and aware. "Mr. Hutchins," Garcia said gently, "I'm Sheriff Garcia from Marfa. I have some news about your son Timothy." Robert's face transformed. Hope and fear and desperate longing all crashed across his features at once. "You found him? After all these years?" "Yes, sir. This woman here, Dr. Whitmore, she found him. He was in the barn, in the loft. He'd been there the whole time." Robert made a sound like he'd been punched. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "The loft. We searched the barn. We looked everywhere. He was hidden in the corner. Easy to miss, especially from below. It appears he was playing hide and seek and got stuck up there. It would have been quick, Mr. Hutchins. He wouldn't have suffered long." That was a lie, probably, but a merciful one. Robert didn't need to know his son had likely lived for days calling for help in the darkness while searchers looked in all the wrong places. Robert was crying now, silent tears down his weathered face. "I looked for him. God, I looked so hard. Tore that barn apart. How did I miss him?" I knelt beside his chair. "Mr. Hutchins, Timothy asked me to tell you something. He said it wasn't your fault. He said he loves you." Robert's eyes met mine, and in them I saw a question he was afraid to ask. I nodded slightly. He understood. "You heard him?" he whispered. "Yes." "In the barn? After all these years?" "Yes. I heard him too. Every day for a month after he disappeared. Calling for me. Begging me to help him. My wife thought I was losing my mind, made me seal the barn. I did it to make her happy, but I knew. I knew he was in there somehow. I just couldn't find him." He gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Is he still there? Still trapped?" "No. Not anymore. He's free now. He said to tell you it's okay. He understands. And he's not scared anymore." Robert nodded, more tears falling. "Good. That's good. My boy. My sweet boy. Trapped all those years while we lived our lives. How can that be fair?" It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. A child playing a game, making a hiding place so good he died in it. A father searching desperately but looking in all the wrong places. A community that boarded up a barn with a body inside and tried to forget. 56 years of a confused, frightened consciousness trapped in darkness, calling for help that finally came. I stayed with Robert for an hour, telling him about finding Timothy, about what the barn looked like, about the toy car that would be returned to the family for burial. I didn't tell him about the scratch marks, about the desperation in Timothy's voice, about the horror of realizing his son had been conscious in some form for over half a century. Some truths are too heavy to share. When we left, Robert was calmer. "Thank you," he said as we stood to go. "Thank you for not walking away, for listening when he called. Nobody else would." The funeral was small, held 2 weeks later in Marfa. Robert was too frail to attend, but extended family came from around Texas. Timothy's sister Jennifer was there, 70 years old now, her hair gray, her face lined with age. She thanked me through tears, said she'd blamed herself for 60 years for letting her baby brother hide too well during that game. Now she could finally let go of that guilt. They buried Timothy in the Marfa cemetery under a small headstone that read, "Timothy James Hutchins, 1961-1968, lost but never forgotten, finally home." I attended the service, stood at the back, and felt Timothy's presence one last time. Not trapped anymore. Not calling for help. Just there briefly to say goodbye. After the funeral, Jennifer approached me. "Did you really hear him? In the barn?" I hesitated, then nodded. "What did he sound like?" "Scared, but also hopeful. like he knew someone would eventually listen. Was he in pain? All those years? I thought about lying, about giving her a comforting falsehood, but she deserved the truth. I think he was confused and lonely. I think he didn't understand what had happened. But I don't think he was in pain exactly. More like he was stuck in a moment, unable to move forward or backward, just trapped in that last day, calling for help over and over. Jennifer nodded slowly. The night he disappeared, he was mad at me. We'd fought about something stupid, who got to use the colored pencils. I told him I wished he'd go away and leave me alone, and then he did. I've lived with that for 60 years. He didn't mention that. He just talked about playing hide and seek. And at the end, he asked me to tell your father he loved him. If he was angry with you, he let it go a long time ago. I hope so. God, I hope so. I left Marfa the next day, my research project abandoned. I'd come to document dying communities, to preserve their stories, to connect past and present. Instead, I'd opened something that should have stayed sealed, had disturbed a tragedy that the community had spent decades trying to forget. I'd found Timothy Hutchins and given him the acknowledgement he desperately needed, but in doing so, I'd reopened wounds that had barely healed. The experience changed how I approach my work. I'm more careful now about what stories I pursue, what doors I open, what sealed places I disturb. Because sometimes there are good reasons buildings get boarded up and communities agree to forget. Sometimes the past is trapped behind those boards, conscious and suffering, and bringing it into the light doesn't heal anyone. It just spreads the pain around. But I also learned something important. Timothy Hutchins called for help for 56 years, and everyone walked away. They heard him crying, heard him begging to be found, and they convinced themselves it was wind or imagination or folklore. They let him stay trapped because acknowledging him would have meant confronting their failure, admitting the search in 1968 had missed him. I refused to walk away. Opened the barn, found his body, delivered his message to his father. And maybe that made me foolish. Maybe I should have left that barn sealed, let Timothy's ghost fade into legend, let the community maintain its comfortable distance from tragedy. But I couldn't. Because behind every ghost story, every legend, every piece of folklore is a real person who suffered and died and deserves to be remembered. So yes, I disturbed something that had been sealed for decades. Yes, I forced a community to confront a horror they'd tried to forget. But I also gave a lost child the acknowledgement he'd been begging for, reunited a father with his son's remains, freed a sister from 6 decades of misplaced guilt, and I helped Timothy Hutchins finally leave that barn where he'd been trapped since 1968. Was it worth it? I still don't know. Some nights I wake up hearing his voice. Please help me. Please, I'm so scared. And I wonder if I did the right thing. If maybe he'd have been better off remaining undiscovered, trapped but undisturbed, rather than being found and forcing everyone to relive that trauma. But then I remember his final words, the relief in his voice when he said, "Thank you for finding me, for not walking away." And I think maybe, just maybe, I did help. Maybe being found, being acknowledged, being finally seen as something more than a local ghost story. Maybe that was worth the pain it caused. The Hutchins barn still stands. Nobody's torn it down or burned it. It just sits there on that abandoned property, doors no longer sealed, empty and silent. I drove past it once about 6 months after the funeral during a different research trip. Stopped my truck and listened carefully. Nothing. Just wind and hawks and the vast Texas silence. No child crying. No desperate pleas for help. Timothy was gone. Truly gone. Released from whatever had kept him trapped for over half a century. The barn was just a barn now. Old and empty and slowly collapsing, but no longer haunted. I still have my recordings from that day. Hours of audio documentation, including the moment I first heard Timothy's voice calling from inside the sealed barn. I've listened to them dozens of times, trying to understand exactly what I experienced. Was it really his consciousness, trapped and aware for 56 years? Or was it some kind of psychic echo, A recording of his last moments playing on repeat in that space, or something else entirely that we don't have vocabulary for? I don't have answers, but I know what I heard. I know what I felt. I know that when I opened that barn door, something trapped inside was finally able to leave. Whether you call that a ghost, a spirit, a consciousness, or just the weight of tragedy made manifest, it was real, and it needed help. That's what I tell myself on the nights when doubt creeps in. When I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the stress of my research and the power of suggestion created an experience that wasn't really there. But then I remember the bones in the loft, the scratch marks on the walls, Robert Hutchins' face when I told him I'd heard his son, the relief in Timothy's voice when he realized someone had finally listened. Those things were real. Whatever happened in that barn was real. And by refusing to walk away, by choosing to listen instead of dismiss, I helped end a half-century of suffering. That has to count for something. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever heard something calling for help and had to decide whether to respond or walk away, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment sharing your own experiences with places that feel wrong, with sounds that shouldn't exist, with the choice between acknowledging the impossible or pretending it isn't there. Maybe you've opened sealed doors and found something waiting on the other side. Maybe you've heard voices from empty spaces and had to decide if they were real. Either way, you're not alone. We're all navigating a world where the past doesn't always stay buried, where tragedy leaves marks that last for generations, where sometimes the dead need the living to witness their suffering before they can rest. Thanks for listening to Timothy Hutchins' story. Thanks for caring about a 7-year-old boy who played hide-and-seek in 1968 and wasn't found until 2024. And if you ever hear a child crying in a place where no child should be, don't walk away. Don't convince yourself it's wind or imagination. Listen carefully. Investigate thoroughly. Because maybe, just maybe, someone is trapped and waiting for someone brave enough to help them leave. They deserve that much. Timothy did. And so does every other lost soul still calling from the darkness, hoping someone will finally listen.